Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to wait just a few more moments to have more people come on to the presentation, but we'll get started very soon. All right, I think we should go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the Where Wildlife Roam webcast. My name is Allie Fisher, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'm the Wildlife and Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Associate for Organwild. I'm really honored to introduce our guest for tonight. Erin Cito researches, develops, and promotes laws and policies geared towards supporting habitat, connectivity, and biodiversity at the local, state, and federal levels. Erin's work also focuses on state agency reform and funding and outreach to promote policy initiatives nationwide. I'd also like to offer gratitude to the land itself tonight and for those who have lived here in Oregon since time immemorial. While this webcast is focused on the movement of wildlife, Indigenous people have long traveled as well, following animal herds and other food sources. These profound relationships with animals last to this day. By working together, we can create a world where species can once again travel freely, which benefits people as well. Additionally, our raffle is still open, but it will be closed by tomorrow morning, so make sure to buy those raffle tickets if you're interested. A recording of this program will be emailed out this week and will be posted on our website, organwild.org, in the Wild blog. Please do enter your questions at any time. We normally get a flood of questions towards the end, so the sooner you get your questions in, the easier it will be for me to go through and organize them after our guest has finished presenting. Lastly, make sure to RSVP for our next webcast, which is next week, about salmon migration, featuring dam removal with a look forward to a future of wild and free-flowing rivers and thriving salmon runs. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Erin.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited here today. I'm just going to share my screen. And just a little forewarning here, I'm working from a laptop because I'm moving this week. So I don't have access to my notes, but the good news is I am really passionate about this work and love talking about it. So hopefully I don't need notes, but just bear with me. I might get excited and remember I wanted to say something on a previous slide and back up. So like I said, my name is Erin Cito. I'm the U.S. Public Policy Director with Wildlands Network, and Wildlands Network's mission is to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America so that life in all its diversity can thrive. And so I'm here today to talk about wildlife's ability and need to be able to move throughout our landscapes. But first, I'm just briefly going to talk a little bit about Wildlands Network and why we care about ensuring habitat connectivity, making sure that wildlife are able to move throughout the landscape. So for over 30 years, we have been studying how we can connect habitats. And we've been doing that through this grand wildway vision. So as you can see from looking at one of our maps here, we have our Pacific Wildway that goes from Baja all the way to BC. Hard to fit the great North American vision all here on one slide, but it goes from Baja to BC up through California, Oregon, and Washington. And then our Western Wildway essentially follows the spine of the continent up through the Rockies. Most of our work is in the southern portion of the Rockies, and we work with partners up in the Y-to-Y region, Yellowstone to Yukon, for those that aren't familiar with all the acronyms that we like to throw around in this field. And then our Eastern Wildway follows the Appalachian or Appalachian, depending on where you're from, corridor through the eastern portion of the US and the basins around them. And so we think about, when we think about the projects that we want to accomplish, we essentially want to create this large landscape of connected wild places so wildlife are able to move through them. It was a great tribute. I thought an awesome way to get into this presentation to talk about how humans, tribes in particular, that wonderful nativeland.net map that Allie put up there of Oregon, it's important to point out that people as well have needed to move through the landscape for quite some time. And so it's easy to understand that wildlife need to be able to move to find food, water, genetically diverse mates, and to adapt to a changing climate. And so when we think about this and we zoom out and we look at it in the big picture, what we're really trying to do is ensure species diversity. We're trying to combat the biodiversity loss crisis that we're seeing across the globe. We've been talking about the climate crisis for quite some time. There's been a small group of experts turn of the century starting to talk about the biodiversity crisis and what we have, and we have island ecosystems. And so now I think we need to start talking about both as if they are an intertwined crisis, the climate and the biodiversity crisis. And so Wildlands Network seeks to essentially bolster biodiversity by ensuring that habitats are connected. And we do this by studying the landscapes, understanding where critical habitat or core habitats already are, and where the linkages are between them that we need to protect, and where potential linkages could be that we can work towards restoring. We also monitor animal movement and behavior around these cores and corridors. And as Ali pointed out, we also work on a policy scale too, working at the local level and at the federal level to help policymakers implement governmental frameworks that consider habitat connectivity when they're making land use decisions and infrastructure development decisions. So again, zooming out here, we're talking about biodiversity loss because it's happening very fast. It's really been happening in the last few decades. So biodiversity loss, for those that may not have heard of the term, it's a decrease in genetic diversity within a species and species diversity generally within an ecosystem. So biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in history. And since 1970, there's been a 70% decline in the populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians, as you can see from this chart here. And now more than ever, it's important to think about because 1 in 4 species are at risk of extinction. So it makes our work even more important. And so how is biodiversity loss going to impact us? Well, there's the ecological impact piece. You have species extinction, never good. Lowered ecosystem productivity because of species extinction. The structure of natural food chains. I mean, we've learned about the food chain and food webs at a very young age, and how if you pull one particular species out, it can have a cascading effect throughout the rest of the chain. Essentially, you are putting our food chains and food webs at very vulnerable, destabilized rates that are vulnerable to collapse. And so this also obviously going to impact us on an economic scale. You're going to have scarcity among common food crops. We've seen this before. For those that have ever heard of the Irish potato famine, that was a biodiversity issue. The Irish people were growing one particular type of potato, and that potato caught a disease and put a big blight on the crop and caused famine. And we're actually seeing a little bit of that now again with bananas. We've seen increased disease among food crops, or sorry, I shouldn't say food crops, but species like poultry with bird flu. And so the more species you have with the same genetic makeup, the less likely they are able the more vulnerable they are to diseases. And the reduction, so another thing that we're at risk of is the reduction in rare plants and animals that we often use to create medicines. And again, like I said, increased disease too. So there's that economic and societal impact. And here we are in 2023, and studies are now showing that worldwide we're losing about $10 to $31 million a year because of a loss of ecosystem services due to biodiversity loss. So not only is it just terrible for the environment generally, but it's also awful for the economy. So how did we get here? Well, there's 5 big threats to biodiversity. That's land and sea use change. So habitat loss, degradation, massive expansion in agricultural land use. You have pollution, you have species over exploitation, so overfishing, overhunting. You have climate change generally. I'm sure everybody has been following the big heat domes that we've been seeing in the Southwest. I mean, we had our own here in Oregon not that long ago, and that's really stressful on species. And then you also have invasive species and disease, and that includes zoonotic diseases. So Habitat loss, though, is one of the major contributors, and it's one of the reasons why we've always focused so much on habitat connectivity and habitat loss. But it's also, when we think about this bigger picture of biodiversity, we feel like this is going to provide the biggest bang for our buck in terms of being able to address the problems and the threats to biodiversity. So when we think about some of the solutions to help combat biodiversity loss, we want to be able to tie these solutions specifically to these threats. And like I said, we focus on habitat loss and degradation, particularly habitat fragmentation. So again, we talked about that issue with these islands of habitats where species are not able to or are deterred from moving from one island to the next. And that can lead to a lack of diversity, lack of robustness within a particular species. One of the better examples I can provide of this is, if folks haven't heard of the Liberty Canyon, or now Wallace-Annenberg crossing that's going up down in Southern California, there's a wildlife crossing that broke ground on Earth Day this year, specifically to connect habitat for mountain lions in Southern California. And the reason why they're putting this wildlife crossing up there is because of the genetic issues within this group of mountain lions that are in this very isolated area on one side of the highway. It's a 10-lane highway. They can't get across as they are now. And they, oops, sorry about that. I have a dog here at home, my own wild one. So she's freaking out at the moment, but sorry about that. So anyway, they're already seeing within these mountain lion populations some telltale signs of a lack of genetic diversity and genetic deformations, kinked tails, also leading to sickness and inbreeding. And so, so this is why, in particular, for the species diversity piece, we need to be able to connect these habitats. But also, like we said earlier, animals need to be able to roam, to find food, to find water, especially in the changing climate where they're dealing with extreme heat and weather events. So what causes habitat fragmentation? Well, there's development, certainly, people building houses, strip malls, there's agriculture development as well. We're definitely clear cutting here in Oregon can certainly cause issues. Fencing is another one, transmission lines, dams, if you're talking about aquatic species, for sure, railways, and the one that we all think about is roads. So roads certainly create barriers in more ways than one. There's the animals like this elk here on the right that are trying to brave the road and get across the road and are finding themselves getting hit by vehicles. And so they're really confined to one space. But then sometimes roads themselves are the deterrent. So that's why I wanted to create this picture, or show you this image here that I saw earlier this week that really kind of describes this issue perfectly. And what we have here is a landscape in southern British Columbia. And all of those red dots are female grizzly bears. And all of those green dots are male grizzly bears. And A and B, those yellow lines, are roads. And they're not even highways, from what I understand. They're not well-traveled roads. Either way, the roads themselves present enough of a deterrent that the female grizzlies are avoiding them entirely and essentially creating these two fragmented habitats. So there's the road's ability to just fragment habitat generally, and then there's the wildlife vehicle collision piece that is absolutely leading to biodiversity loss. And that's what we're here to talk a little bit more about today, is wildlife vehicle collisions and wildlife crossings. And so every year in the United States, there's 1 to 2 million car collisions with large animals. So the way that we get to this figure is we're considering carcass counts. So that's your DOTs going and picking them up off the roads, insurance industry data, police reports, and then again, the public can also now report where they're hitting animals as well. And there's a lot of states actually creating apps for that, where people can go and log in and let folks know where they were hitting an animal, which, if you have that in your state, hope that you sign up for it, because it's really important to collect all of this data so we know where to put crossings and what animals are at risk. So it's 1 to 2 million large animals a year, but I have to point out that the total estimated number of road killed animals per year is estimated at 365 million deaths a year for animals on our roadways. And for those that haven't put two and two together already, that is essentially the entire US human population. Only wildlife here that's killed on our roadways every single year. So when you're talking about biodiversity loss, it's an absolutely staggering figure. And this is from back in 2008 when Federal Highways put their report out to Congress. So how can we help to improve habitat connectivity and biodiversity? And some of these, we're going to talk about wildlife crossings, definitely. But I just want to offer a few other options too, because we have to think more than just on our roadways. We have to think beyond roads too. So a few things that we can do is advocate for actions that strategically conserve lands, critical to facilitating wildlife movement. We can build those wildlife crossings. We can advance wildlife-friendly fencing initiatives. We can create stopover sites for species like birds and pollinators. We can prevent harmful collisions for birds. And one of the things that I like to advocate for too is advocating for nature-based climate solutions. And obviously, one of my favorite things is working to pass laws and advocate for policies that support all of these potential solutions above. So what do I mean when I talk about strategically conserving and restoring lands to facilitate wildlife movement? Well, I talked earlier about our wildway visions, and here we have a map of our Eastern Wildway. And this map is part art, part science, we like to say, because all of the green spaces here are either protected spaces or large core habitat areas where we know that animals are able to thrive. And then all of these light green spaces in between are the corridors that should be connected between them. So we're advocating to strategically protect those light green spaces to make sure that animals are able to move from core to core. So that's our Eastern Wildway. But you don't actually have to look further than your own state to see some great work that's been done to strategically conserve land to promote habitat connectivity and animal movement. So this map was actually released just 2 weeks ago. I can drop the links to this tool in the chat here when I'm done with my presentation. But essentially, there was a group back in 2016 of stakeholders, both federal agencies, state agencies, NGOs, and some private groups too, that all came together to figure out how can we best study and understand where we need to conserve wildlife corridors so we can improve habitat connectivity throughout Oregon. And so the group came together and came up with a strategy on how they'd like to do this. And from that sprang this study to create the Oregon Connectivity Assessment and Mapping project, sorry. And so that process was started in 2019, and then it was completed in 2022. And like I said, this map was only just released 2 weeks ago. So it's really fun to zoom in and look at where you are and whether or not you're living in a wildlife corridor and what you can do to help facilitate movement within a corridor core. But these darker spaces here are sort of the core habitats, the regions. I'll zoom in onto the next slide because we have a better image here. So yeah, so the regions, the dark blue are the core habitat places. The yellow spaces are the connectors between them. And then there's these stepping stones, and the stepping stones are essentially, pretty solid pieces of habitat that can't necessarily be connected because of existing homes, businesses, infrastructure. But as we know, sometimes animals do cross the road. And so if they do make it out into these landscapes, these are these sort of stopover sites, essentially stepping stones, as they call them here, to get back to these core areas and the corridors between them. It's really cool. You can zoom in, you can click on these polygons, and they can tell you who owns the land, whether it's private, public, and then what their recommendation is. Do we just conserve it? Do we restore it? You can look at all of that online. It's very, very cool what Oregon has come up with recently. I'd also be remiss if I didn't talk about Florida as a success story. So back in 2021, Florida passed the Wildlife Corridor Act. And what that essentially did was recognize this corridor linking the whole center of the state from the Everglades north to ensure that wildlife are able to move from the Panhandle down to the Everglades, because What we have in Florida is just massive amounts of development. There are about 1,000 people moving to the state every single day. And the state needed to figure out a way to strategically protect the wildlife and wild spaces that make so many people move to Florida and love Florida, but also, to protect the wildlife and make sure that they are going to be able to be there for generations to come. And so not only did Florida pass this act and designate a corridor, essentially, it also appropriated that same year $300 million to help acquire lands within the corridor. And that was in 2021. Just this past legislative session in 2023, Florida allocated or appropriated over $1 billion to acquire land within the corridor in some very specific places. So really amazing what they've done. It really is a cast of like unconventional allies there for sure. It's environmentalists, it's ranchers, it's really everybody that just loves Florida and loves the wild spaces and want to make sure that they're going to be there. So definitely want to give a round of applause for Florida. So in addition to strategically conserving landscapes to facilitate wildlife movement, like we said, we also need to consider where we already have this infrastructure, where we cannot conserve the land, how can we restore it? And one of the ways that we can restore the land is by building wildlife crossings. And so this image above is an overpass, I believe it's I-90, the Snoqualmie Pass, which is one of the bigger projects in the Northwest. And then below here, I have a bear using an underpass, because sometimes when we think about wildlife crossings, we think about these huge multi-million-dollar overpasses that are obviously so visible to drivers going by, but you'd be surprised how affordable and effective underpasses can also be for so many species. So I just like to highlight both here in this presentation. So I always like to point out that it's properly sited wildlife crossings with directional fencing that can reduce wildlife vehicle collisions by over 90%. For those that may not be familiar with wildlife crossings or talk to their family members that don't understand wildlife crossings, I know my dad is one of those people that has consistently asked me, like, what's stopping the animal from, trying to cross the highway 100 feet before and after this multi-million-dollar project? And I tell him, well, Dad, that's because we have directional fencing, miles and miles of essentially directional funnel fencing that pushes the animals to a particular crossing. And when I say properly sited, you want to understand and have data that shows sort of where animals are naturally going to the road anyway, and where they are crossing more often. That's where you're going to have the most bang for your buck and where you should most likely put your wildlife crossing. So in addition, depending on the species the crossing is built for, a crossing can also pay for itself over time. Like I said, a lot of these projects can be multi-million-dollar projects, but what we find is that occasionally, well, not occasionally, quite often, these collisions, especially with large animals, are very costly. And so when you're building these crossings and you're reducing wildlife vehicle collisions by upwards of 90%, you're also reducing the costs associated with those collisions by upwards of 90%. And one of the great examples I like to talk about is this one proven example from this wonderful person that we work with in Virginia. And she essentially worked on a project that only added fencing to existing culverts that were there. And again, that fencing reduced those collisions in that particular area at those few culverts by over 90%. And they were able to recuperate the costs on that fencing within 2 years. And not only that, but once they recuperated those costs within 2 years, now they're saving an additional $2.3 million a year per culvert crossing because that fencing is up there. So pretty effective, pretty impressive stuff when you're putting these crossings in the right locations. And like I said, these collisions that you're having with these large mammals, they can be quite costly. And this chart here, this was released in a study at the end of 2022, looking at figures from 2020, but you're looking at, the cost of vehicle repair, human injury, fatality. I don't think that this necessarily factors in like lost days of work, but that's another one that often comes up. you're looking at 2020, you're not even really necessarily, factoring in inflation here. I've heard figures from Virginia where just the cost to repair a car alone sometimes is upwards of $20,000. So when you hit a deer, and so it's rather staggering. And so when you're thinking about reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, you're just reducing an astronomical amount of costs associated with them. And they're working. I'd like to say that it's not just, elk and deer. I'm sure you saw grizzly bears and wolves also on that list. So endangered species, it's also critical to make sure that they're not getting hit on our roadways. We had OR 93, the very famous traveling wolf that came to its untimely end just a few years ago with a vehicle strike. P22, the mountain lion that essentially was the talking point on the Southern California crossing, also recently got hit by a car and perished because of it. And so we want to make sure that it's not just for these large ungulate species, it's also for endangered species. So I'm just going to back out of my slides for a quick second because it's a very cool image of this wolf here from our 395 project, but that is only the second wolf that we've been able to capture. And I want to be able to show you, this is the first wolf that we know of that we have on camera using a wildlife underpass. And this is in Northern California on our 395 project. We work with a great group in Northern California called Pathways for Wildlife, and they do excellent camera trapping around these crossings. And like I said, it's so important to collect this data so you know what animals are in the area, what their behaviors are, and whether or not they want to use the crossing. So I'll just shut up for a second and play this video. I know we all want to see it. So when we talk about images, data, and studying animal movement, I just think it's so important to point out right there how cautious that wolf was to even use the crossing. And that's not uncommon. So where I'm getting at there is when I talk about wildlife movement, it's not always that any animal is just going to use any crossing. So for example, we know that elk don't necessarily like to use underpasses. They prefer overpasses. It's a predator-prey issue from what I understand. They just don't like to be in that confined space where they are at risk of becoming prey. So we've talked a lot about large species. I always like to say, don't forget about the smaller species. Remember, if it's 1 to 2 million large wildlife vehicle collisions a year with large animals, when you're talking about that $365 million number, so you know that a lot total, that a lot of the species getting hit are those small to medium-sized animals that people hit, they don't stop because it didn't necessarily hurt their car or hurt them. But when you talk about sheer numbers and biodiversity loss, these small species, the diversity of small species getting hit absolutely matters. So, why do we talk about larger species all the time? Well, obviously it's the cost piece. We're trying to get policies across the line. You want to talk about something being, fiscally responsible and efficient, the ability to recuperate the costs on the crossing. You're often going to get that when you're talking about those large animals that you're hitting. You also have more of a public safety concern with larger animals. For anyone that's ever hit a deer, it's terrifying. Nobody wants to get hurt. Nobody wants to see their loved ones get hurt. And so a lot of the talking points around building wildlife crossings has been on reducing those big collisions with big animals. I will say that we're starting to see a shift in the narrative, particularly in East Coast states. So if anyone's been watching the news lately and has seen just an incredible amount of rainfall, storms, and flooding in Vermont, New York, that's putting increased pressure on culverts. And like I said, culverts can provide an excellent opportunity to create a wildlife crossing. A lot of the culverts that we have built into our old infrastructure on the East Coast, they're these smaller culverts that were mostly designed just to accommodate water overflow. They weren't necessarily designed with wildlife in mind. but they also weren't designed to accommodate the increase of water that we've been seeing in recent years because of human-caused climate change. And so there's going to be a lot of funding going into creating resilient infrastructure in East Coast states and in any state really that's experiencing flooding and needing to up the size of their culverts. And so for smaller species, we're starting to see some opportunities and combined benefits where we can increase the size of culverts and simultaneously create some sort of dry passage for smaller species within the East Coast. So we already have some excellent co-benefits and talking points for large species. That's recuperating the costs on crossings. That's, reducing public safety. But I think that there's really some obvious co-benefits that we can work into some of the states experiencing flooding, where we can have some wildlife crossings built in there to the culvert retrofits that are already happening. So again, I just want to go back to this Oregon map really quick because, we talk about wildlife crossings and how wonderful they are at connecting habitat. I need to point out again that it's so important to additionally make sure that the habitat on either side of these crossings is able to stay a core critical piece of habitat that animals are using. So when I talk about properly siting a crossing, it's not just understanding where the animals are moving, but it's knowing that the lands on either side of them are going to stay, preserved, so the animals are going to use them. You don't want to put up a multi-million-dollar crossing if there's soon to be, a Hobby Lobby, development on one side of the crossing. The animals are not going to use that as much, and so you're not going to have that benefit year over year. So just want to make sure that we're using great tools like this to understand sort of where those critical areas already are and where we see roadways cutting through them. If we also know that there's wildlife vehicle collisions happening there, which that data is available to online, then you can figure out where some of the best places are to put these crossings here at home in Oregon. Also want to flag too, because I was at the DMV earlier, if you're wondering how we can help, how you can help if you are not a lawmaker, if you are just an average citizen that works a very busy job, has a very busy life, and wants to know how we can help. I know Oregon has so many wonderful conservation license plates to choose from. One of the newer ones is the Watch for Wildlife license plate. So I believe all the funding there is managed through OWF. And the funding there helps with wildlife crossings and connectivity projects throughout the state. So definitely consider a license plate if you don't already have one. The other thing that we can do, which is obviously one of my favorite things, is pass laws and advocate for policies to support all the efforts that we previously talked about. So strategically conserving lands, building wildlife corridors. And so I just want to briefly kind of talk about the rise in policy here, because it is a relatively new phenomenon. We had, I want to say it was like 2008, so late 2000s, where we started to see the Western Governors Association and some of the Eastern governors and Canadian premiers that were putting out these resolutions to preserve habitat connectivity within their states. And then in 2016, I think, I know it was under the Trump administration that Secretary Zinke issued Secretarial Order number 3362 with the Department of the Interior to improve habitat quality in Western big game species. And so ever since then, there's definitely been an uptick in states that want to tap into the funding that's available for that, and additionally create plans to ensure that big game are able to move through the landscape. And after 3362 was issued, we also saw an incredible rise in state habitat connectivity policy. So New Hampshire was the first state to pass a full-on wildlife corridor assessment bill, and that basically required its state agencies to look at where existing habitat connectivity was throughout the state, where they needed to restore it, and what were the state statutes that were either getting in the way or needed to be improved to help effectuate change and improve habitat connectivity in New Hampshire. And then not long after, Representative Ken Helm championed a bill, House Bill 2834 in the 2019 legislative session, that essentially tasked the Department of Transportation and ODFW to collect and analyze data to create a wildlife corridor action plan. So luckily ODFW had already been thinking about this, ODOT I believe as well, and was working on the OCamp project. I believe they had gotten a grant to do some of the research to create that OCamp model, which I had just showed you. But this law took things a step further and essentially tasked the DOT with coming up with a plan to address, motorist safety, wildlife vehicle collisions, and update that plan every 5 years. And since then, Oregon's been really good about setting aside funding to help move this work along. So last year, they appropriated $7 million for crossings. And then this year, the governor just signed another bill that set aside $5 million for habitat connectivity projects. So really exciting to see all this work happening at the state level. And I really feel like the state and federal relationships on this have been pretty cyclical in terms of advancements. So all the states were doing incredible work. The Biden administration comes in and they, as part of the America the Beautiful initiative that Biden explained and put in his secretarial order when he first took office, was to really focus on, conserving 30% of US's land and waters, but also to conserve habitat connectivity while doing that. And so a lot of the agencies have been thinking about, well, how are we going to tackle connectivity? The Forest Service has already had some connectivity language within the Forest Planning Rule of 2012, but the Bureau of Land Management didn't necessarily have any policy that really encouraged regional and state managers to incorporate policies and planning for habitat connectivity within resource management plans. So just last November, BLM put out an instructional memorandum that essentially tasks all the states with figuring out their priority species that they want to accommodate within their resource management plans that are coming up for review, to make sure that there's habitat connectivity for those priority species. And the BLM has to consult with the states and has to consult with the tribes too, to figure out what those priority species are. So I do think Oregon's in a pretty good place because we do have a good amount of data and modeling already available and ready to provide to BLM, which is pretty exciting. And then most recently in March, CEQ released a memo to all of the federal agencies, essentially tasking them with reporting back to CEQ in 180 days to talk about what they're already doing to preserve habitat connectivity, and if they're not, what their plan is to address it and make sure that it's considered within land use planning and contracts and really everything. So pretty exciting. There's a lot going on at the federal level now on implementation efforts. So it's been quite an exciting few years for policies. And so even in 2023 alone, I want to say there was roughly 20 state laws introduced to help conserve and restore habitat connectivity. So it's really gaining traction. It's really a bipartisan issue in most states, which is exciting to see. And so we hope to see more of it in coming years. And then the other piece I'll just flag here, if you're wondering what you're looking at, aside from just all of those habitat connectivity specific policies that have passed in recent years, there's also just an incredible amount of federal funding now available through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and through the Inflation Reduction Act. And this is just these are just some of the options available. So specifically, there was dedicated funding set aside for a wildlife crossing pilot program. So over the course of 5 years, there's going to be $350 million given out to states and tribes to construct wildlife crossings within the US. So very excited to see that. It's a first of its kind program. We are trying to make sure that it is very much taken advantage of so we can advocate in the future to make sure that funding is permanent and increased. But in addition to the wildlife crossing pilot program, there is a ton of funding available, as you can see, for that culvert work, the National Culvert Removal, Replacement, and Restoration Program. $1 billion from the IIJA is going to that particular program. So there's roughly about 15 programs that were either created or expanded from the IIJA that can help fund wildlife crossing as well as wildlife mitigation projects within infrastructure projects. So other options to bolster biodiversity, you can support legislation or conservation projects that advance wildlife-friendly fencing initiatives. I know ONDA, for those that are familiar with ONDA, Oregon Natural Desert Association, I believe, they consistently have volunteer opportunities where you can go out into Eastern Oregon and camp and basically create wildlife-friendly fencing for pronghorn. So you can definitely get out there and get your hands dirty. Don't always have to call your legislators. And then the other two things I like to highlight is just helping to create stopover sites, like I said, for pollinators. So green roofs are always an option. Bird-friendly buildings can reduce collisions, which are also a huge problem for biodiversity loss, particularly with birds. So I just like, thinking of the bigger picture of biodiversity, there's so much more we can do. And it is related to habitat connectivity as well. It's helping animals move through the landscape without bumping up against our infrastructure that we've put in their way. And the last thing I just want to talk about briefly is, the opportunity to embrace nature-based climate solutions. We talked about all the funding available to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for wildlife crossings, but there's also an insurgence of money through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the IIJA, to support nature-based solutions that states can implement. And so what I mean by that is, creating ecosystems to help combat climate change and help us have more resilient landscapes. And I always suggest it because we think about this in the context of climate, but as you can see from looking at so many of these options, you're also essentially creating habitat. And what we know for biodiversity loss is that it's habitat loss and fragmentation and degradation that are the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss across the globe. And so just to really drive that home, we cannot solve the biodiversity crisis without solving the climate crisis, and we cannot solve the climate crisis without solving the biodiversity crisis. The two are interlinked, and by helping to preserve habitat connectivity, which I hope you all will take some small part in the future, we're also able to help with the climate crisis and help with animal adaptation to it. So I believe that is all I have for everybody today, and I'm happy to take questions and share the links to the Oregon mapping tool, which I will find right now and drop in while we get our questions ready.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erin. That was really informative and interesting. Organwild has supported these connectivity initiatives, and we work really to protect habitat as it relates to ensuring that there are these protected places and key wildlife corridors or areas. And then, yeah, we have quite a few questions, so I'm gonna get started right away. The first question is, to what extent does the Pacific Crest Trail function as a habitat connectivity corridor? If you have any insight into that.
That's a great question. I wish our Pacific Wildway map was ready. I was asking our team today if we could show it. But it's like the main artery. The Cascades are 100% the main artery, I would say, for wildlife, and the Pacific Trail goes right through it. And so, yes, it is like the corridor, I would say, particularly in the western part of both Washington and Oregon. And there was a really great wildlife crossing project. I think I showed a picture of it that went on I-90, because I-90 is that highway that completely fragments that corridor. And I believe that project consisted of at least 4 both like overpasses and underpasses to help move all types of species across that landscape. And if you go on YouTube, you can see all sorts of videos of animals using it.
Awesome. Next question is, are there land trusts or other nonprofit organizations in Oregon that are seeking to acquire and set aside land to support habitat connectivity?
Yes. I don't know the exact name of the one that I've heard doing this, that I know for sure is doing this, but I believe there's one in the Northwest Coast region that has, consulted, I think, with ODFW to get some of this mapping information, make sure that they're conserving land strategically. And then I would say there's Southern Oregon Land Conservancy 2, I think is the name of it, that's been very involved in a coalition down there that's specifically around wildlife crossings and connectivity to help make sure that the land is conserved on either side of crossing that they're working on down there. And then I know COLT too, Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. We've been in contact with them. There's a group called the called OAT. I want to say it's the Oregon Access Team, and they've been doing a lot of the education and outreach around this mapping tool and are planning to do more of it. And it is part of the plan to make sure that land trusts are engaged in this. So more to come on how to use this map for land trusts for sure.
Awesome. Another question asks, where can we go to help build fences for wildlife? I know you mentioned ONDA, the Oregon Natural Desert Association. So if you go to their webcast or website, you should be able to find that opportunity, but are there any other ones that you know of?
That's the one that I've seen doing the volunteer work. That's the only NGO that I know of doing that in Oregon, but essentially there's nothing stopping anybody, especially if you are a landowner in Oregon and you're wondering, you know, is my fencing friendly for wildlife? You can certainly go look at it. There's certain heights that you can put your fences at, and then there's smooth wire versus, you know, barbed wire, to make sure your top line and your lower line are smooth. So there's all different things that you can look at, especially if you do have the fences yourselves, to make sure they're wildlife friendly. So it's always an option too.
Next question is, are tribes engaged in this work?
Oh, absolutely. So we've been partnering with Native American Fish and Wildlife Society quite a bit. And, you know, working with them, they've been telling us that, you know, tribes have been collecting data on wildlife movement since at least the 1980s. And when I say data, I mean, like, you know, your traditional Western data. But when you want to talk about, you know, traditional ecological knowledge, they've been studying wildlife movement forever. And so in addition to just having that data and that understanding and that traditional knowledge, there's at least, I want to say, 50 tribes in the West alone working on big game mobility and, you know, big game movement throughout the reservations. So if you are interested in working with the tribe, I highly suggest getting to know what they're doing already, seeing how you might be able to help. But I think that excitement is generally high among the tribes for this, particularly too, because this administration is putting a lot of money out for this work and also trying to do more listening to the tribes to make sure that that money is accessible for them.
Makes sense. Thank you. Next question is regarding opportunities for wildlife crossing when culvert upgrades are required for flow capacity increase. Is there a requirement in Oregon for wildlife crossings mandated by highway widening projects for a capacity increase?
That's a great question. I don't know, but I would be a good question to look into. I don't think so. There are some states that have that mandated for their DOTs. I know New Jersey is one of them, but I don't think Oregon does. That is a guess, but if not, maybe it's something to consider. The policy.
Next question is, do you have examples of any crossings that have been built for smaller animals? I know a lot of focus is for the bigger animals, but if you have any examples of crossings that have gone really well for some of the smaller critters too.
Yeah, there's a few. And so I should say too that smaller species can end up using the same crossings that you know, bigger species are using. We're doing a study in North Carolina right now on rattlesnake crossings. We've supported some work in Utah for prairie dog crossings. There's some work right now, I believe, in the Mojave Desert around tortoise potential crossings there. So, and actually in Vermont, there's some excellent examples of salamander crossings, because so often we find these roads are separating the ponds from these vernal pools that they cross to be able to breed, and they're just getting crushed on the roadway. And actually, I think they're trying to do one up around Skyline Drive too for frogs in particular, for the same reason, because they're crossing over the road to get to different vernal pools. No crossing there yet, but certainly something local to look into where we might be able to help smaller species.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of projects related to amphibians and other species that need water. So I was curious about that.
Yeah.
And just looking at the chat related to the volunteer opportunity, someone put in that Cascade Forest Conservancy is another place to volunteer. So ONDA and then Cascade Forest Conservancy seems like the two options. Let's see. So as far as wildlife crossings go, what is the average price for these crossings? And maybe if you could go a little bit into more about how states are paying for them. I know that it is very cost effective, but just curious on some of the numbers.
Yeah, so I'd say like in terms of cost, it can be really site specific. So for those that have heard of the Wallace-Annenberg crossing that I talked about for mountain lions in Southern California, that's slated to be the biggest wildlife crossing in the world because it's 10 lanes of highway. And that's looking like it's going to be about $80 million now. So pretty expensive crossing. I'd say the average used to be about 5 million. But that's just when you're considering the crossing alone. You have to consider inflation a little bit since I last heard that number just to materials. Then it also depends on the species that you're building it for. You know, are you talking about an overpass or an underpass? An overpass is going to be more expensive usually than an underpass. And then there's also roadway considerations. Do you have to shut down a roadway to be able to build the crossing, or can you not shut it down? And then you have additional like added safety costs to make sure that drivers are safe while the construction is happening. So I will say it sort of depends on the situation, the location, the species. But in terms of how folks are paying for it, definitely there's some excitement around the funding from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Like I said, Oregon and a few other states are setting aside funding through legislative appropriations. I think Nevada just set aside 5 million, Utah set aside 20 million, New Mexico also set aside 5 million, all just this year alone for wildlife crossings in their legislature. And then Wyoming actually puts a portion of its outdoor recreation funding to conservation projects, and wildlife crossing projects are eligible for those funds. And each year the legislature decides where that money is going to. And wildlife crossings have been funded both the last 2 years in Wyoming from that pot of funding or wildlife infrastructure.
Okay, looks like we have about time for 3 more questions unless some others pop into the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and get started with that. Can directional fencing associated with wildlife crossings actually contribute to more habitat fragmentation?
It can. I think it's important to recognize that there are certain smaller species that, depending on the type of fencing you're putting up, if they aren't able to make it through the fencing, they have to go quite a long way to get around it. When you're talking about miles of fencing, and they can get, depending on the species, if it's tortoise, they can get overheated and they won't make it. It could be a deterrent. They just turn around and say, I'm not even going to try to cross that road. And so that's why I think it's so important to make sure that you understand what species are in the area when you want to put in a crossing. So if you're thinking just generally about a larger animal, and that's what you're really putting the directional fencing up for, maybe accommodating some smaller entry and exit points for those smaller species that can't get around the fencing to continue to go through it. I hate to say it, I don't necessarily want them in the roadways, but sometimes it's, more beneficial for genetic exchange for smaller species to at least try and brave the road. Unless you can put additional smaller crossings for them under, but sometimes that's more expensive.
I know that would be ideal, just tailor it for every species.
Yeah. A few crossings here and there.
Yeah. Okay, last 2 questions. So I know that Oregon kind of lags behind other states as far as the number of crossings that we actually have. So if you could speak to that and how we compare a little bit, and then is there anything in the docket for Oregon, anything that we can look forward to, or if there's any legislation that's been passed?
Yeah, so definitely lagging in terms of projects constructed. I think that we are the state in the West that has the least amount of crossings built. But I hate to knock Oregon entirely because I feel like they've just done an incredible job with doing the studies first and understanding where things need to go. We had some catch up to play in that sense. And so with the release of this tool, I'm hoping that we're able to, facilitate more wildlife crossings. And then additionally, there's the legislative funding that came out that Oregon's going to have to spend for both wildlife crossings projects, at $7 million, but then the $5 million for habitat connectivity work. And I do believe that I'm pretty sure I'm allowed to say that Department of Transportation will be trying to take advantage of some of those Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding. I think they are applying to a wildlife crossing pilot program grant. And so hopefully it's a very competitive application and we'll see our first big crossing in Oregon. We'll know in the next few months whether or not they get their award.
Awesome. I'm actually going to ask 2 more questions. One's very brief though, but second to last is someone's wondering if the slideshow could be shared after the presentation.
Sure.
Okay. So I'll send out an email to everyone that registered for this presentation, including Erin's presentation, and then also the link to the study, because I definitely want to take a look at that in more detail. It's super cool.
Yeah, I was thinking I was going to try and put in the chat, but I realized it's a webinar, so there's no chat. But I'll make sure that you get that.
Yeah, awesome. But no worries, you will receive an email soon with both of those. And then last question that I have for you tonight is, what is something you're excited for looking into the future as far as habitat connectivity and wildlife crossings go?
Oh gosh, I mean, we're just in implementation mode right now, right? We've just been like setting the stage with all the studies, with all of the policies, and now, I actually got to drive by the mountain lion crossing like last weekend when I was down in Southern California for a wedding, and it was just so exciting to see us like finally breaking ground. And so I think the next 5 years, especially with all this federal funding, we're going to see a lot happening. And it'll just be cool when one day it's just a natural thing to drive by one of these on a highway and everybody knows what they are. It's fun to see it be a mainstream conservation effort for sure.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to echo a comment and say that I really enjoyed today's presentation. Someone said, excellent presentation, thank you. And we're having others comment that as well. So just thank you so much for everything. Really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone in our audience for tuning in. And I will definitely send an email with those resources.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. And thank you everybody for loving the topic. I hope you get involved.
Awesome. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.